Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it.
Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. Today, I am thrilled to introduce someone who has dedicated his career to protecting wild places and the species that call them home, Jay Tutchton. Jay serves as a Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commissioner and is the preserve manager for the Southern Plains Land Trust in Bent County, Colorado, where he spends most of his days caring for splits. That's right, I said split. That's what we call it for short sometimes. So if you hear us use that, that is the Southern Plains Land Trust. He cares for the Land Trust reintroduced bison herd and restoring over 32,000 acres of prairie for the benefit of all native life. Before trading the courtroom for the wide open prairie, Jay spent 3 decades as an attorney representing environmental organizations and individuals fighting to protect the environment. He also helped launch the Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Denver's Sturm College of Law, where he's taught courses in wildlife, animal, and environmental law. Through his work, Jay is not only rebuilding an American Serengeti on the Southern Plains, but also inspiring people to fall in love with Colorado's lesser-known landscapes, the grasslands that once stretched as far as the eye could see. Jay, welcome to the Wildlife Wire.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
No, we are just thrilled to have you. And I mean, your career is just incredible. And I'd love to know, when did you start caring about the environment? When did it first come into your conscience that this is something I should be concerned about, or something that you're passionate about?
Wow. uh, you know, in some ways, it's been there as far back as I can remember. In those earliest memories, you're not sure you remember it or you've just heard stories told about yourself as a young child. But the outdoors where I grew up was my playground, and my entire it was right on the edge of Denver, and my entire childhood was just one place after another where my friends and I used to hang out and play outdoors and observe animals and nature getting slowly chipped away by development and the sprawl of the Denver area. And but my mom would say stories about, like, there was a creek I used to play in, and uh, I had brought home a tire. Someone had thrown a tire in my creek area where we used to, go and try and catch frogs and whatnot. And I was really upset that this tire was in my creek, and I was about the same size as the tire, so apparently it was quite a struggle for me to get this tire home. And he was furious at me for bringing home this tire and putting it in the living room, covered with mud. And but so I guess that's a long-winded answer to. It goes back as far as I can remember, and that's where I spent my time. And from the very beginning, I felt a sense of loss, that I was losing these places that I enjoyed.
Yeah, I certainly experienced that. I grew up in Southern California in a suburb it was 50 miles southeast of Los Angeles. And it used to just be these rolling hills and all sorts of, kind of high desert like landscape. And I'd go outside all of the time. And then slowly everything became parceled off and became tract homes. And I grew up going to the nature center and playing in creeks, and there was always a washed out riverbed where we go watch coyotes. And I think for a lot of us that live on this kind of urban wildlands interface, you start to see that sprawl firsthand. And I certainly identify with that moment of loss. My next question would be, was there a certain species that was your gateway drug to wildlife protection?
Well, on that, the it might be the prairie dog, because there was a prairie dog colony within walking distance of where I grew up. And that was the best place to find horned lizards. and which were quite and box turtles and snakes, which were the other like catchable by a kid creatures that I was interested in. And I'm not sure if I knew that they existed there because of the prairie dogs. I just knew that's where you would go to find them. So it could have been the snakes, the turtles, the lizards, but it was also this prairie dog colony that was right there. And back to your comments on the loss that probably a majority of Americans have experienced in their lifetime. You know, the outdoors was our daycare. Like there was no daycare center. Your parents just said, "Get out of here," and you went. And I didn't know trespassing was a thing until I was relatively older. Like we just wandered, and that prairie dog colony was the first place I got kicked off of because people were shooting the prairie dogs, and it was a point of and they just like, "Hey, you kids are trespassing. You need to get out of here. We're shooting guns." And I was again like, "What do you mean? Like we come here every day and you don't?" But it was always anyway. That again, too long of an answer to a straightforward question, but it was the little approachable prairie wildlife, uh, not the charismatic megafauna that actually first drew me in.
Yeah, man. So I grew up on the East Coast in the Atlanta area, and I'm glad that hearing the two of you also, when I was 9 years old, we moved, and my one requirement for the new house was access to a creek. And creeks are just so important for children who want to be outdoors because there's so many different species that hang out there, big and small. And if I had the access to prairie dogs when I was a child, oh my God, it would have been the best. My daughter yesterday was at a prairie dog colony, and she was just over the moon with excitement for seeing these little guys. And so you had that nature background growing up. It was part of you. It was part of who you were becoming. Then you went to law school. When you went to law school, was that specifically to get into environmental law, or you knew that just law in general was something that you wanted to practice?
Well, specifically, it was for a woman.
I knew it.
It became my wife, and it was something I could do and be in the same city that she was located in. But my secondary goal in going to law school was I had been reading about groups like the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, which is now Earth Justice, and NRDC, and people fighting to correct what I thought were abuses of the natural world. And so that was my goal in law school. I wasn't interested in corporate law or business transactions. I'm like, how do I become one of these people I'm reading about in the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund magazine?
Yeah, Jay, your environmental law lore that I have heard coming up in environmental advocacy and wildlife advocacy is impressive. You've managed to get many species listed for endangered species protections, from reptiles to plant species. What's one of your most proud moments as an environmental law attorney?
Well, the biggest thing was, so for years, we were frequently accused of advocating on behalf of designer species. That's what the charge was, which was that
Designed by who? By God? Who designed them, Jay?
I guess no, the charge was.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, selected by us
Uh-huh.
to interfere with someone's plan.
Mm.
So, say, well, like the Pearson's milk fence. Um, it lives only on a patch of sand dunes down in Southern California. And we were accused of only caring about the Pearson's milk fetch so we could interfere with this chaotic dune buggy sand rider motorcycle party, like perpetual weekend party that was
Glamis?
Glamis sand dunes.
I knew it. Tell me
So,
about a dune buggy party and I can name it.
and so people like thought we were insincere, that we just wanted to ruin their thing on behalf of some species they'd never heard of. But from that, what we decided to do was get the nature serve and the IUCN Red List, identify all the most critically imperiled species in Southwest and the Rocky Mountain region, and petition the Fish and Wildlife Service to list all of them. So we could no longer be accused of just cherry picking from.
I like this.
You can say, look, the best scientists on Earth have compiled this database, and this is the list they came up with. It's scientifically peer reviewed, and it's the best available science. Here's 700 odd species scientists say we're losing. You guys work through it in the order that you choose, and let's just get these things protected. We're not selecting, crisis flashpoints just to create a political firestorm. And we eventually settled that case and put the Fish and Wildlife Service on like a 5-year workout plan through that list of species. And I was that was something that, and I didn't do that by myself. There was Center for Biological Diversity was a big part of it. Wild Earth Guardians, several other lawyers were involved, and it was successful. And so that was probably the biggest accomplishment in the listing world. And it's funny because those were 700 species identified by the ICU and Nature Serve. And Fish and Wildlife Service agreed about 20% of the time with the rest of the scientific community out there. But we did get a couple hundred things added to the endangered species list.
20% is probably 100% better than they're doing now. So that's not a bad track record. Did you have any threats or face any controversy while you were advocating for these species using the law?
Oh, yeah. Client received a pipe bomb in the mail on multiple occasions. I had to be, and my clients, escorted out of the courtroom, escorted into the courtroom by law enforcement. There was a wolf hearing up in Montana, and on the way in, it was kind of like an abortion protest. There were people like lining the sidewalk, yelling at me and showing me pictures of cow mangled, just like I call them gnarly photo guys, but it was the same vibe. And like, do you support this? And there's a picture of a mangled cow. And
were they waving their dead cows at you, Jay, or their lambs? Just carrying their lambs and laying them at your feet. Yes.
Just the photos. But anyway, after the hearing, where we were successful, I was, in the courtroom, and I was getting ready to leave, and this large man came up to me in the hallway, and he's like, "You need to come with me." He didn't identify himself. I'm like,
"Of course, I'll go with you right now."
Yeah, I was like, "Well, why should I come with you?
Do you have candy?"
You're in danger, and I need to get you out of here, and I'm trying to help. And for whatever reason, I trusted the gentleman, and it turned out he was a prison guard. So he had the vibe of someone you should probably listen to if you're a relatively smaller person like myself.
Hey, seems like you would have conformed in prison quickly, Jay.
But he led me out of there, and we became friends for a while remotely. He sent me like pictures of wolves chasing bighorn sheep, and the bighorn sheep like trying to decide like just how big of a cliff they could jump off of, or whether they wanted to face down the wolves. It was pretty
Wow.
stunning.
Wow.
No, it just comes with the territory, unfortunately. And when you do uh, litigation that gets politicized, you get the same environment that we're seeing now rather routinely, unfortunately, with people behaving uncivilly in what's supposed to be called civil litigation.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch that from the advocacy sphere too, where it was a lot more conversations across the aisle for a long time, and now it's very much siloed even more. I know Mark and I are trying to work hard at bridging that divide a bit, but it's definitely, you can see it, things get more and more polarized, and I think the media certainly doesn't help that. Mark and I were probably the last generation to go through high school, without having smartphones and with, having dial-up internet access. And it's the rate and speed as to which information spreads can be both good and bad, I think, especially as we are in a changing climate and changing world. Uh, Mark, did you have other questions about Jay's law career before we go into Southern Plains Land Trust?
Yeah, yeah, I know because he's gone from courtrooms to pulling fence posts, which is what he's going to be doing after this interview. I did want to touch a little bit on the Strum College of Law and you getting the environmental law clinic going there, and like how how did that start? What was the vision there, and were there challenges to getting that moving forward?
Yeah. So I was actually working at an environmental law clinic at University of Colorado, Boulder, and a DU law professor named Fred Cheever and a former Earth Justice attorney named Mark Hughes were starting up the DU clinic because law schools compete, right? So if one law school has an offering, another law school wants to have the same academic offering for its students. And so they hired me to come down and start running a clinic at the University of Denver. Initially, law schools weren't sure if they liked this or not. So they liked the clinics to be set up as independent 501c3s so that the law school could deny responsibility if we did something that maybe upset their donor base, which of course we decided to do pretty much right away.
Upset the donor base is what you
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Well, Mark sued Coors for polluting Clear Creek, and we had nifty things like pure Rocky Mountain spring water, but not when it comes out of their brewery. um,
Now, to be fair, there's very little difference between clear Rocky Mountain spring water and a Coors Light.
yeah, you only rent them, as we used to say in high school. It's just a rental arrangement. But the we got a letter that we were proud of, which said from Pete Coors that said something like, "I know Mark and Jay, they're good lawyers. There's no way they should be allowed to influence law students." And uh, we were proud of it, actually.
Yeah.
And the dean was supportive. And over time, when I was later on, the same thing happened with Excel. We sued Excel. Excel like canceled contracts with our engineering school to allow internships for the engineering students. But both times, the law school administration said, look, it's academic freedom. These guys are providing a valuable legal experience. And by the way, Coors and Excel, we assume you can afford better lawyers than
These two.
well, a couple of hippies and then law students.
And
Uh,
for those who don't know, Excel is the predominant power company in Colorado.
Yeah, and you're hippies that can't be bought, Jay, which that makes you priceless. Priceless.
Well, it's an effective negotiating tactic when you're in those situations to make the point that I'm doing this for my clients for free. And this is what I love to do. You guys are paying your lawyers $300, $400, $500 an hour. And I'm happy to do this as long as you want. Or we can try to come to a settlement and you guys can stop running the meter with your law firm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I I love that tactic too because they'll just keep paying out and paying out and paying out as you fight, 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 and eventually you get the settlement, which is killer. So thanks for doing that work, Jay. That's important work. And speaking of work, you went from courtroom work to fence post work. How did you make the transition from being a full-time attorney to managing the Southern Plains Land Trust?
Well, again, the short and perhaps the most honest answer is there was another woman involved. If I look back on major decisions in my life, it frequently involved a woman. Um, you know, more other than doing it to help out someone you love. The law, you win cases, right? You can force, say, the federal government to write a new environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. So you can keep putting the pen back in their hand and say, try again. That one was illegal. Why don't you come up with an? And sometimes they'll do it 3, 4 times in a row. And so you can't make them write a good decision for the environment. Same thing with listing a species. You can say, look, you violated all these legal standards and rules, and you made a poor decision when you denied that species protection. And they may well come back and find another reason to deny that species protection. So it's a bit sometimes law, or you lose an election, or your perceived team loses an election, and all these things are undone, with the stroke of a pen. So it's a little like rolling Sisyphus, or I think it's Sisyphus, the guy who had to roll a rock uphill and
Ah,
then it
yes,
rolled back
absolutely.
down. And so if I remember that myth correctly, he focused on just taking joy in rolling the rock up the hill. And even though he knew it was going to roll back down. And so I really, for years, enjoyed fighting the good fight because I felt compelled to do it, even if you knew sometimes it was a bit like rolling this rock back up and down the hill. But what was attractive about getting into private land conservation was when we, the collective that is split, make a decision to manage in a certain way, we can just go do it. And like to go circle back to fence posts, there's nothing more cathartic. We decide we want to remove a barbed wire fence because it's interfering with antelope movements, or it's a vector for catching weeds and proliferating weeds, or it's a danger to entrapping our bison, getting tangled in a wire. And when we go out and pull that fence out, it's done. It's not coming back. And so, like, as I've gotten older, those those successes, even though they're small and local, they have meaning because they appear at least more permanent. And I started off getting into environmental law because I love the outdoors. Spent 3 decades, as Sam said, in a courtroom, or at a typewriter, and then later a computer, often alone in a library. Like, law is not like it is on TV. Like,
Yeah.
all the time you're in the courtroom arguing is minuscule compared to the amount of time you're researching and writing and preparing the briefs. And it's an indoor game. Like, I think during that settlement I described earlier to get all the IUCN and NatureServe red list species listed, I calculated I'd spent 19 nights sleeping in the Philadelphia airport because I could fly a red eye from Denver to Philadelphia, sleep in the airport, and get the early morning plane to DC because couldn't afford a hotel in DC. But like, I was like, I know the janitor in the international lounge in the Philadelphia airport. I see this guy regularly.
Yeah.
Lounge, they don't have armrests on the chairs. So it's a great place to go sleep for a couple.
Oh, pro tip by Jay Tutchton.
Pro tip. Ooh.
Yeah. If you're ever stuck in an airport, look for the international lounges are more comfy than the domestic.
Yeah, I joke with my colleagues a lot at the center about how we are constantly fighting for the wild, but we are often tied to our screen while we're doing it. And there's nothing I loved more than when I took a break to have a little ranch myself and be outside and, put in fence or pull fence or, work on my riparian area or try to figure out invasive plant species and restoring native plants. And I think there's something really fulfilling about that hands-on work. Can you tell the listeners about some of the species that are on the Southern Plains Land Trust and what you do with management there? And I'm saying management in parentheses, but I may remove the parentheses if you're not killing them, Jay.
Well, we certainly try not to.
Okay, go ahead.
So, like, I think in your introduction, you mentioned American Serengeti. And so the overall mission of Southern Plains Land Trust is to preserve prairie land for wildlife, which, not for necessarily for humanity in the first instance, but a place where wildlife is free living to the extent possible and doing its own stuff, and the human interests are a bit secondary to wildlife. So we don't have like unfettered recreation. We don't have hunting. We're not trying to do anything commercial in the sense of produce a product, or some people say, the land has to pay for itself. Right? I've heard people say like the bison have to pay their way. And so we try to stay away from that sort of thinking. But now that we have black-footed ferrets back on the landscape, I think we have pretty much everything that would have been here in pre-European colonization, with the exception of the big predators. The grizzly bears and the wolves, and even the cougars and the black bear are. Well, the grizzly bear and the wolves are not present. The cougar and the black bear are incredibly rare and transitory. But we have the whole suite of everything else that was once here, and that's sort of our goal.
And so with that main reserve in eastern Colorado, so that's like about 60,000 acres, correct?
Heartland Ranch, which is the big preserve, is currently about 43,000.
Okay.
We just saw deeded acres, and then state leases would bring it up to about 45,000 acres, and then splits total land holdings in ownership and a couple conservation easements are over a little over 60,000.
Gotcha. And so you have bison out there. How does that work as far as this large 2,000-pound species on private land? Are they, when we talk about private lands like in Africa and things like that, you're going to have tall fences. What do you have to have fences? Like, how do you keep the bison there? And then how, beyond the black-footed ferrets, how did the other players come to find the reserve?
Okay. So, well, the bison containment issue, this Heartland was, we bought it in 5 increments. It depends on how far back you go, but that 45,000 acres was once carved up into 160 acre or 320 acre parcels. There's 3 abandoned elementary schools on the land, 2 abandoned post office. This is really a place where at least 1910s, 1920s European American idea of how you would interact with the land completely failed in a catastrophic manner in the Dust Bowl, and the area rapidly depopulated. All those homesteads were abandoned. There's a cemetery. It's right across the county road from our, like 150 dead people in the cemetery. There's 3 people who live on the preserve today. So, from a place that had grade school. So between the Dust Bowl and when we started to acquire the land, nature restored itself primarily. And so a lot of those things came back once the people failed and left for the most part. And the only activity really was cattle grazing. Farming utterly failed. Though, there's still farming in the area. I would still describe it as mostly a failure. It's dry land farming, and it primarily exists because it's insured. I don't think it would
Good
exist.
business model.
That's lovely.
If it was subject to full market risk, I don't think it would exist. But so cattle grazing is about the only thing that actually works in this landscape. So bringing back the bison is not much of a change in that sense. But I was supposed to answer about containment. We tore out all the interior fences. So all those pasture fences that once exist, over 50 miles of little carving pastures around a water tank, and to the extent rotational grazing was used, moving the cattle through these pastures. You don't need that with bison. They move themselves. We don't need all the water sources. We're decommissioning some of the wells because bison are much more willing to move further from wells. And as the wells get turned off, springs and seeps and things are coming back to life. But I guess bribery is the most direct answer to how I to stay home. Force is largely ineffective. And we wouldn't want to and could not afford to build Africa-style fences. So we just have a wildlife-safe fence around the perimeter, 4-strand barbed wire, just like, but top wire is smooth and the bottom is 18 inches off the ground, so the pronghorn can go under. And then the bison just have found it's a good place to hang out most of the time. It's not 100% successful, and we do have escapes, and hopefully you have to rely on the goodwill of our neighbors to help us out, and their cows escape onto us sometimes. So it's a kind of a two-way street.
Dude, you said the goodwill of your neighbors to help you get a bison back. How does that are you just going, come on, buddy, come on? Or you get them in a trailer, or like, I've done big animal transports, and those are difficult.
So there's 2 basic strategies. One is I have one truck, which I call like the cake wagon. It's kind of like the ice cream truck. So I try to only have that truck interact when they're going to be fed this treat that they really like. So that method is essentially like in the old days before it became creepy, and so it was like the ice cream man who would come in. And all the kids would run for blocks after that song.
Yeah, do you use a song?
I had a siren for a while, but it got dust, and they can find the truck. I mean, I don't know if they're hearing the sound of the engine or what. They know that truck, and they will come running to that truck to get a treat. So you can use the bribery method. If that doesn't work, you can use force, which is normally chasing them with ATVs, because horses I wouldn't recommend it. The bison see the horse still as an animal, and they are unafraid of other animals. And so the ATV also goes 45 miles an hour all day long.
Right.
The bison can do about 30 miles an hour all day long. And so you need that internal combustion engine that doesn't get tired if you're going to chase bison. And so that's the other method. They do bulls leave one at a time. The cows and calves and the younger animals, the sort of cohesive herd, they move as a block. They're actually quite easy to herd because they have such high fidelity that they stick together like glue. I've also herded cows. Cows will sometimes scatter. People call it the herd blew up, and it just goes
Yeah.
which way. Bison don't do that. They stay together as a group, and so if you get the group headed the right direction, you can even leave one behind, and it'll be chasing you if it's like tired or old or something because it wants to catch up with its friends.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I am familiar with cows blowing up. That's always fun to try to get them back together again and moving in the right direction. Uh, my question really is about the difference between cattle grazing on the land and bison grazing on the land. How how does each species affect the ecosystem differently?
Well, um, I can give you some hard data, and then I can give you my observations.
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist. I think a scientist could give you a whole million things.
No, we like soft observations, Jay. So you don't have to worry about hard data. But yeah, no, some hard data we'll take whatever you've got and then tell us some stories. We like that.
When the bison first arrived, we also adopted at that same time some Texas Longhorn, who I would say are much more mobile than Angus or Hereford. So on the mobile side of the cow spectrum. And I put a radio collar, we put a radio, I had a lot of help to put a radio collar on one Longhorn, the lead cow, and one bison. And we got data. And the cows of the 45,000 acres, the cows visit in total about 4,000 of those acres.
Oh, wow.
You move on average 1 to 2 miles a day total. Um, the bison visit every acre of the 45,000 acres and move on average 7 miles. And then the bison's collar went dead because it was solar powered and fur covered it. But the other real distinction is riparian areas. Cows will just destroy a riparian area. Especially when it's like sometimes I refer to them as hippopotamuses because
Yeah.
they're drawn to that area. They will stand in it, wallow in it, behave essentially like hippopotamuses. Venture out at night to
Right, which is not safe with predators either, like all of their behaviors are not adapted to our landscape at all.
no. So bison are more like deer and elk. They can still have an impact on a riparian area, but they tend to visit it, get a drink, and leave. And so we have springs that appear to scientists to be ungrazed, but they're grazed by bison. It's just there's no real lingering, no preference for the riparian vegetation like you see with cows. Like cows strongly prefer like young cottonwoods and the tall, lusher grasses that are found in riparian zones. The bison will walk away from that to go back out on the flats in the open areas and eat buffalo grass, which is a third or less the height of that other stuff. And I think it's because they still have that instinct, like the riparian areas where you get jumped by predators, or they just prefer having a large visual horizon. And the cows are more so. And I'd say the bison, there's no such thing as poisonous plants to a bison. I've never heard of a bison dying from eating the wrong plant. You hear about that with cows every summer. They eat yucca. Cows will not touch a yucca. So they have a broader palette of things that'll eat in some sense, or more tolerance for different vegetation. Um, I would say they're a lot lighter on the landscape than a cow for our purposes. If someone else could talk about how much biomass they use or whatnot, but because they spread themselves out, go far from the creeks, eat a variety of plants, and keep moving all the time, you don't see like bare dead zones develop like you do with cattle grazing unless you forcefully move them from pasture to pasture.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense, and it is fascinating. I didn't know about their how much their diet can can change and be diverse and eat all those different plants. To be fair to the cows, if given the opportunity to walk around in a hot, mostly treeless area or wallow in a stream, I'm going to choose wallowing in a stream. So I don't blame them, but they're not helping. But speaking of streams, so a friend of the pod, Keegan Kuhn, was out there and in the film that he produced for Southern Plains Land Trust, you were out at a river and beavers had moved in. And first, so did those beavers come naturally there? And then what is the current state of their work getting that stream back up to it was highly eroded, right? And just checking on the progress of how their work is going.
Yeah. So the beavers pursued a field of dreams strategy. You build it and they will come. So we were doing human powered restoration of streams. And before we really saw much results, to be honest, we found the beavers and they got there on their own. I don't know how they got there, but they found the place and they started doing their beaver work, and their dams are better than ours. Just in a flood
No
survivability.
way.
Uh,
Nature's doing better than humans are.
yeah, they work on them, 24/7, 365. And we work on them on like sporadic weekends, and so they really are magic rodents in their ability to restore riparian ecosystems. They seem to have a knack for picking the spots. And you know, we look at water, it's you look at it, it could be waist deep, could be over your head, right? The beaver somehow, well, he measures it. So like we were shocked, like one of these things that I thought like I could get in chest waders turned out to be 14 feet deep.
Oh, wow.
How was your dip?
Yeah. I ended up without the waders.
Yeah, pro tip, don't go into water deeper than your waders.
But they really do a good job. And what's amazing is the landscape's still largely treeless. These beavers, they build bank dens and they eat primarily cattails. I brought them wood, just a tree from an urban area, bring down a truckload of, tree trimmer limbs. And it was like I littered.
Like, how dare you?
Like, why are you throwing this crap in our pond? Like, they didn't touch it. It just sank to the bottom, made great fish habitat. But the beavers were profoundly not interested in trees. These are like true prairie beavers.
Jay, I mean, your body of work is so impressive, and I certainly could talk to you longer than this hour that we get with you. But with all of your work, where are you seeing the greatest needs for humans to participate going forward? How can people really make a difference in the landscapes around them?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I mean,
It's food for thought here, on the Wildlife Wire. So you can answer it with just a piece of that puzzle. You don't have to solve the whole thing. But we love to give our listeners somewhere to go and a way to engage with that kind of work.
well, I mean, there's always, well, I'll give the big answer first and then the little answer. The big answer to me is that people continue to care. And even if in their wheelhouse and where they live, they're still the type of person who picks up trash and puts it in the right place or recycles or engages in their community and supports green space or, what I feel sometimes when people are faced with an overwhelming, multifaceted dismantling of the natural world, they minimize individual action, like their personal choices that they can make that make a difference because they're sort of sitting back and waiting for the government to do it or some larger international body to take care of these giant problems, and they discount that each of us can do that on their own. If you're concerned about climate change, you can take actions in your own life. If you're concerned about biodiversity, you can plant a pollinator garden in your little patch of urban landscape. There's never an action that's not worth doing. And I think that's the big answer. Little answers is like we rely heavily on volunteers. And I know a lot of other organizations rely on volunteers. We're supported largely by private philanthropy and donations. And so there's a lot of ways that people can get involved. On the near-term horizon, Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado is coming. I think it's September 20th and 21st to build beaver dam analogs. Help these guys out. And One Rock Dams, they're another sort of riparian improvement micro project. And so they could, I guess, visit Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado website or Split's website and plug in. And it's an opportunity to come and see the place and contribute to its restoration. It is physical work, so it's not for everyone, but it's something that's out there.
Yep, and we will certainly put a link to Southern Plains Land Trust website. You can check out upcoming volunteer opportunities on there. I always tell you that I'm going to get out there. I will make it someday. If you put me to work all day, I love monotonous, repetitive manual labor, and so we are thankful for you to come on the pod today, hear about your background, which is almost like a Superman background in that you went from the suit and tie into your work on the ranch clothes. And so I love that transition for you. And we appreciate all the work that you've done in so many different ways to benefit species of all kinds. So thank you for coming on the Wildlife Wire.
Well, thank you guys for the invitation. It was a real pleasure talking with you, and your love of nature comes through in the way you approach these type of questionings. So I appreciate you guys as well.
This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.